Kindly share with us some memories of Cambridge at Nigel's time. Before Garth begins, I would like, on behalf of Jenny, who asked me to do so, to thank you all on Jenny's behalf for being here during that week. Okay. Please, Garth.
Well, I hope this will be very informal. And well, first of all, I should say thank you very much to Gilles and Jenny and various other people for inviting me here. I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit about my memories of Cambridge and Nigel, and I'm conscious I might make errors, and I hope there are at least two people here who know what happened. I haven't really planned this so that it will ebb and flow as people. I welcome questions and comments. And it did strike me that there are some young people here for whom events of 50 years ago might seem a little strange. The political and social background of Cambridge in the 1960s is very, very different from universities of today.
Still very different.
It also, I thought I could say a little bit about the mathematics that I think Nigel would have studied. That's not quite the same as saying I know what he studied, but what I'm guessing he studied while he was at Cambridge. I'd be very interested to make any comments about comparison about what Paris was like at the same time. There were strengths and probably weaknesses about the mathematics at Cambridge. Anyway, a few remarks to start with. How did the educational system in England work in these long-off days? At that time, children in England took an examination at age 11, and they went to either a grammar school, that was about 20% of the population, and about 80% went to what was called a secondary modern school. So I came from a small town in the north of England, and I passed this examination at age 11, and there was no choice about which school I went to because, well, I would say there was one grammar school in the town, but thinking about it, of course, there were two grammar schools in the town, one for boys and one for girls, and they were separated by a considerable distance. Nigel was born and grew up in South London. So there was, of course, in London, very many schools. So my guess is that Nigel took this examination at age 11, that he would have passed a hurdle to admit him to the grammar school, but there would be a choice of grammar schools in South London. So Nigel went to Dulwich College. Unlike the modest high school that I went to in northern England, this is a school of huge reputation and history of several hundred years, with very high academic standards and a very fine campus in the south of London. I know, Steve probably knows as well, that there were a lot of people who've come out as strong mathematicians went to the same high school. I don't know if you know my friend Chris Lance in C-star algebras. He was at Dulwich School, I think 3 or 4 years before Nigel, and I know several other mathematicians. But Dulwich is a private school, and private schools means paying fees. And I presume Nigel got a scholarship. So the system then, either subsidised by the state or the school, would have put Nigel in this very special school. So the competitive standard with other boys, it was a boys' school, with other boys at that school would have been fairly intense. And I should imagine the quality of the teaching, the range of expertise, for example, in mathematics in all subjects at this high prestige school in South London would have been very strong. And so it's something of a tribute to our system in those times that someone from a not wealthy background, such as Nigel, because of his ability, could enter a school of this high quality and without paying, I believe.
As far as I know.
So that's how we did it. Now, Well, in England, in those days, you took an examination in many subjects at age 16, and then you chose to specialise for an examination that we call A-level. And that you take in 3 or 4 subjects. I took maths, further maths, physics, chemistry, and a little bit of English, and my guess is Nigel took the same.
Yeah, I think it was mostly all math, yeah.
Yes.
And history, I think, yeah. Very similar.
Yes. Yeah. So I took these A-level examinations, I have to check my dates, in 1962. And in those days, to normal universities, you could enter British universities straight after A-level when you left school, but that was not the case for Oxford and Cambridge. That you had to spend an extra year of preparation. This is not the case now. They're on the same basis in this respect as other universities. So I took the A-level examinations in 1962, and someone at the school told me, why don't I take the Cambridge entrance examination in mathematics? And this was an astonishing idea for me, because I didn't think people from my small town went to Cambridge, but I took the examinations in December. And in fact, I was the first boy from our school to actually pass this examination, take a scholarship examination. So I took the scholarship in mathematics in December 62 to enter Cambridge as a maths student in 63. So you'll see I have 7 months between the exam and entering Cambridge. And I was quite well prepared, and the way I prepared was by reading Hardy's Pure Mathematics. And I guess I knew it all before I went to Cambridge. Now, Cambridge before that time had a very gentlemanly first year. Cambridge in times past, but not when I was there, was a place where quite a lot of privileged people, quite a lot of people of wealthy background who went there. There were still some of those by the time I was there. But they had a very gentlemanly first year, and most of the serious mathematicians skipped the first year. But they reformed the so-called maths tripos 2 years before I went there. And they got rid of all this gentlemanly introduction, and the new first year was the old second year. So I, together with almost all students, took the first year in the first year. I'm slightly ashamed to admit this now. Did you take the first year in the first year? So you see 2 ordinary Cambridge students here. But Nigel took A-level 1 year after me. So he would have taken A-level in 63.
Oh.
And then he took the scholarship to Cambridge in December of 63. The scholarships were run by the university, but the exams were run by the university. But in those days, the scholarships were organised by the particular colleges. So you did not make an application to be a student to Cambridge in general, but you made an application to a particular college. I was in awe of places like Trinity and King's College, which I'd heard of, and therefore must be famous, and therefore I didn't think I could get into them. So I went for Queen's College. Nigel took the examination 1 year after me and put down the most competitive and the most famous college, which was, of course, Trinity College. Actually, the college that took in the most students. Trinity had an intake of about 30 to 35 maths students a year. Basically, the best 35 students in, maybe I'm exaggerating a little, but the best 35 students in the year. Some formidably strong mathematicians were students at Trinity College. So Nigel arrived in Cambridge 1 year after me, and whether he planned this in advance or whether he reacted when he saw what happened in the first year at Cambridge, do you know this?
I have no idea. I didn't know him then. So yeah.
Well, he looked at the first year syllabus and decided he knew it all. And he was right. So he entered the second year directly, and therefore he entered the second year at the same day as I did, and we were in the same class from then onwards. But that means that he was a year, between 1 and 2 years younger than I was. So the number of students who went directly into the second year at that time, instead of being about half the class, which it had been 2 or 3 years earlier, became a very small number. And for those who know functional analysis, there are 1 or 2 other future mathematicians who entered the same class in the same way at the same time. The particular person I think of is the person I call Sandy Davy, who is called A.M. Davy. You know him, Bill? Do you? I mean, his work is formidable, but in fact, Sandy Davy was even younger than Nigel, because he's Scottish, therefore he'd taken the different educational system in Scotland from England. So he'd taken not the English A-level examination, but something called the Scottish Highers. So he was even 1 year younger than Nigel. And I remember him as, he must have been about 16 when he entered Cambridge into the second year, and he looked about 13, and he was quite formidable. But I think there were about 5 or 6 students who entered the second year directly. 2 of them were Sandy Davy and Nigel, and they were formidable. I was particularly frightened of Sandy Davy because the system at Cambridge made us sit in alphabetical order of surnames. So, as far as I was concerned, Sandy Davy was the randomly chosen student who happened to be sitting next to me. And I hadn't, when I thought, if all the students are like him, I'm in trouble here. But fortunately, they weren't. Anyway, what I wonder is, maybe Jenny can tell me, what is clear, therefore, that if I've got this scenario right, Nigel took the entrance examination in December and went to Cambridge the next September and was confident enough to think he knew the first year. And what I wondered if Jenny could tell me, did he do this because he studied by himself? We all know that he was formidably quick at learning, so it's not surprising in that respect. But I wonder, did he do this by self-tuition? Or did he have some inspired teacher at Dulwich College, or perhaps some family friend? I mean, how did he learn the first year in 6 months?
Really
Do you know this?
I have to say, I think it might have been teachers at Dulwich College kind of pushed him into this, I think.
I mean,
But
that's
I really
plausible,
don't-
because that would be a very high-powered school that
Yeah,
would have
yeah.
particularly talented teachers.
Right, yeah.
Teachers who are way beyond the average standard of a high school teacher,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
would be themselves probably Cambridge graduates.
Yeah. That's what I think, but I really don't know for sure.
Well, okay, that's some remark about how Nigel got to Cambridge. A remark or two about the position of Cambridge at that time. Of course, it has its huge history. We have some, basically going back to the great Newton and so on, but it was in the doldrums in the 19th century. The maths tripos was revised significantly by Hardy about 1910, and that was the great change. So the 19th century was a disastrous time in terms of the history of Cambridge in mathematics and science, but with just 1 or 2 individuals. But by the 20th century, it was beginning to catch up. You know that Hardy, for example, was the one who introduced serious analysis following all the cours d'analyse of France. It was Hardy who brought European standards to a backward Cambridge at that time. The math department at Cambridge among students was dominant in the country, if for no other reason, because of numbers. At that time, the percentage of the children aged 18 who went to universities in England was 4 or 5% of the population. So the number of students doing a math degree in England, I say England rather than the UK because the rules and traditions in Scotland, say, were quite different. But in England at that time, I think there were about 1,000 students doing a single subject maths degree at an English university. There are now about 6,000. But at that time, I think there'd be about 1,000. Of those, 300 were at Cambridge. At that time, there were only 100 students a year doing maths at Oxford, say, and rather small numbers in London universities. So 300 out of 1,000 students. By your time, the numbers would have, well, it would still be 300 it's still 300 now at Cambridge. It's 300 out of 6,000 instead of 300 out of 1,000. So the relative power must have declined. Okay. The class was hugely dominated by males. Because you applied to particular colleges at Cambridge, you either applied to a male college if you were male, or a female college if you were female. And at that time, there were 18 male colleges and 3 female colleges. So the percentage of female students at Cambridge at our time was about 10%. What would it have been at Paris at that time?
Well, it depends maybe on which institution you took off. That is, until the mid-70s, most of the French institutions in mathematics, I'm thinking about École Normale Supérieure and the agrégation system, were separated, men and women. Okay, so there were as many girls as boys in École Normale. The 2 École Normale were simply separated. Okay, but the numbers were comparable. I would say in Rudul and Sèvres, there were about 30 students on each side. Okay, these institutions merged in the mid-70s. I'm afraid to say, but it's just to be conformal to reality, that the result of this merging was a sharp decrease in the number of women doing mathematics. It's a simple fact. One can take any opinion or corollaries of that simple fact. But at the time, again, that we speak about, in mathematics, at this level, men and girls, or boys and girls, were separated in France.
Right.
And the numbers, again, were roughly equal.
Yeah.
In those cases.
In fact, of the class that Nigel and I were in, something like 300 took, well, a few fell by the wayside, so it was probably about 250 took the final examination, and of those, between 60 and 70 got a first-class degree. And there was 1 female out of that 60-odd people, and that was a lady called Deborah Hughes-Hullett, who went on to some American university, I think, called Harvard or something like that, and worked with Andy Gleason, and became quite prominent in math education. So she was in the same class as Nigel and myself. What were the courses? The main courses that I took in the first year were called Analysis 1 and Analysis 2, Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. They weren't wildly exciting courses. I remember the first lecture of the first year, and they made no concessions to explaining why you might be doing mathematics or anything like that. I remember the first lecturer walked in and said, I shall take the construction of the rationals for granted. And by the end of the first hour, we'd done the Dedekind cut construction of the real numbers with no motivation whatsoever. That was just what we got. Anyhow, as I say, I did real analysis in the first year and linear algebra and fairly straightforward things. So that in my second year, I took analysis 3 and analysis 4. So this is what Nigel was taking in his first year, aged 18?
I think so, yeah.
Yes. So analysis 3 was complex analysis. Was that was true in your time, was it?
No, there was a course called complex analysis. And analysis was metric spaces, analysis on our.
So there you see they changed between my time and Steve's. Complex analysis was a fairly tough course. It finished up with the Riemann mapping theorem. So Nigel would have done the Riemann mapping theorem. Well, I did it in halfway through my second year, but it's halfway through Nigel's first year. And then in analysis 4, a tribute to the French here, because the course was taught by Ben Garling, whom someone I guess many people here know. And that was metric spaces and Nord spaces. And the book on which Ben Garling based this course was Dieudonné, Foundations of Modern Analysis. Did you do that book?
Well, of course I didn't read it.
You didn't read it?
I can only congratulate Cambridge to have made the right choice.
So Nigel would have done Banach spaces in the second half of his first year. In algebra I found fairly tough because the first year algebra was quite reasonably straightforward. We did rings and fields, linear algebra and so on. I remember in algebra 3 we got tensor products, and I must say I got a bit lost on tensor products. That was the course. Okay. What I should also say is that the subject we were taking was called mathematics, but that's broader than may appear just from the title. Because the mathematics covered on the one hand pure mathematics, algebra, analysis, geometry, number theory, and so on, but also covered what in England is called applied mathematics. I think this is rather special to England. If you are going to do quantum physics and relativity theory, or gravity, or fluid dynamics, or Navier-Stokes equation, where would that fit in France?
Well, I don't know, but I would say, I speak under the supervision of my colleagues and country people here, but it's hard to call anything applied in France, It's like a bad word, So it's supposed to be theoretical and possibly useful to something, but you would not call a course applied anything. Okay, that's my first reaction. Maybe things are slowly changing. I don't know. I welcome contradiction.
Well, the course that was called Mathematics at Cambridge, which seems very narrow, perhaps to an American, wasn't quite as narrow as the title suggests, because material that's in engineering departments and in physics departments at American universities would fall within mathematics at Cambridge at that time. There was also a reasonable amount of statistics. Of course, we could choose by the time we got to the third year, so I and Nigel presumably concentrated on pure mathematics, but it was still necessary to take some applied mathematics. You couldn't just do pure mathematics. So I did a course of someone called Polkinghorne, who was Professor of Gravity. That was quite a good title. And he did sort of relativistic gravity and so on, and quantum physics, which I rather enjoyed that, but I found it too hard, so I had to do analysis instead. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit more about the courses in the third year, but I'd like to tell you, detour into a little bit about the living conditions. In many ways, that was a golden era of funding by the government. An era I am of the age which had the best deal from the British government in history, I think. Because if you go back earlier in time, people from a modest background, such as Nigel and myself, probably wouldn't have got to places like Oxford and Cambridge. But after the Second World War, introduced rather surprisingly by a Conservative government, a Conservative Minister of Education, we had the 1944 Education Act that opened up, all high schools became free, and there was free entry to the universities. So Nigel and I would have paid no fees at all to the university. In some sense, fees were paid on our behalf, but the money went straight from the government to the university, so how much it was somehow irrelevant to mere students there. And then they gave us a living allowance, which I recall, which was means tested.
Right.
And so there was a maximum and a minimum, and this was based on your family income. And since my parents were really quite poor, I got the maximum allowance, which I can reveal to you was £350 a year, and that went quite a long way in Cambridge. And my guess is that because of his family background, Nigel also would have had...
Actually, I think his parents did have to pay some.
Well, he was, as the Americans say, a tad better off than I was. I made one remark. Is he taking a photograph? This is about meeting girls, you see. This was something which I thought was a fairly desirable activity. And then I met a young lady whose father was rich. So in some sense, a desirable young lady to meet. But in some sense, life turned over. Because I'd got a very poor background, I'd got the maximum grant. She had a well-off father. He was actually a professor at a university. And so she got the minimum grant, which was supposed to be made up by her father, who never bothered to do this. So I don't know what your relations with Nigel were, but I was sort of relatively well-off when I was trying to entice this young lady into going out to dinner and so on. Okay, that's a little bit about the living allowance. Maybe I should get back to mathematics. The system of examinations was quite different from the modular system that we have now, and what I think is the American system, whereby you take you go to a lecture course, and then you take an examination on that lecture course at the end of it. Is that a universal system in America now, and has always been? In those days, and I think probably still at Cambridge, you took an examination at the end of the first year, which I did, and Nigel didn't because he skipped the first year. And then you took an examination at the end of my third year, his second year, and the examinations had 10 questions on them. And the examinations were not localized to a particular course. So you took the first examination, and the 10 questions were a melange of material that you might or might not have learned from one lecture course. Even within individual questions, you might require background in algebra and analysis, say, to solve the particular questions. The questions were also very different from those that are at most universities now. They were not routine, they were challenging. And the rumour, the gossip on the street, was that if you could... and there's great premium on getting what the Cambridge system called alpha questions. So it didn't like you to get a few marks for a large number of questions. It wanted you to get a complete answer, possibly to a small number of questions. So the going rate for getting a first class, which means about 60 students out of 300, was 4 questions out of 10. If you could take these papers and do, say, 4 questions, you were on track for getting a first. But you can see that that means that particularly talented people could perhaps do much better than that. So, in some sense, from the bottom up to the first class was 4 questions, and yet the people at the top, of whom Nigel was one, were probably getting 8 or 9 questions out. This seems to me formidable. It frightened me. But there you are. Now, that would be the French system, wouldn't it, at that time?
It's comparable to the French system as I knew it, and it's probably still the case. Although the questions are probably not displayed in the same way, but what you described, that you should not restrict yourself to routine questions, and that some questions require information from different fields, and are not necessarily pure algebra or pure analysis or whatever, resemble very much to the type of things you meet when crossing the oral examination in, say, École Normale Supérieure. You know? But in France, to this day, it may change someday, but to this day, the oral examination is very important. That is, you stand in front of a blackboard, and you are supposed to react to the fellow who questions you. You know, the written part is, of course, important, but the oral examination, where the person you are facing is totally free to ask you essentially whatever he wants, is an important part.
So that's totally different from the English tradition. There were, at the undergraduate level, the first degree level, no oral examinations. And examinations were also, to my mind, a test of stamina as well as a test of mathematics. Because I wonder if this was still true in your time. When I took part 2, that is the examination after my 3 years, I took 6 papers of 3 hours, and they were 9 to 12 and 2 till 5 on 3 successive days. So the whole of your 3 years and your chance of being a graduate student in the future, your chance of the future, and in the English system it keeps track of this. It's very you know, years later, you find people saying, "What score did you get in the Cambridge examination?" and so on. It seems a stupid way to judge people, but that was the reality of things. And
well, I should say, but I should let you speak about Cambridge. And in my country, and again, fix me if I'm wrong, but the Grande École where you were from is still playing a big role. You know, if you have been a Normalien or not,
yes,
it makes a difference. To some people, I mean, in my own opinion, this is stupid, but my own opinion is irrelevant here, okay? That's the Ancien Régime side of the French society, you know. We cut the king's head 2 centuries ago, but part of this remains true. You know, you have caste, and you are from that one or not from that one, and it makes a difference for many people. Would you disagree with me?
Well, it's changing.
Very good. If it changes, it's a very good news.
so just to explore the difference a little bit. And Cambridge had a history of accepting particularly boys, young men, who came from distinguished families. By the time I was there was an element of that. For example, there was someone whom you may have heard of, who now goes by the name of Prince Charles, who was at Cambridge when I was there, and there was a very strong suspicion among the other students. He probably didn't get as high a score on the entrance exams as some of the other people, but who knows. But it was also true that, as you can see, people like myself and Nigel, who did not come, I think, from wealthy or landed families in any way, could get there. Was that also true in France, do you think?
Well, we don't have Prince Charles in France. He's not to the same extent. And also, education is free to this day. Okay, this may happen to change, but tuition is negligible, if not zero. So there is still, in theory, a chance for people from not wealthy family to reach a certain point. And it's still true. I mean, some people in this room can testify about it. Whether this is not changing for the worse is a very touchy question. I don't have the figures with me. I do believe, I remember people who are sharing the same promotion as myself in École Normale Supérieure. A good third of them were coming from really non-wealthy families. If it's still true today, I'm not sure. I'm afraid that it goes the wrong way in France in terms of percentage. But this would demand careful checking and on the actual figures, which I don't have with me now. But at least in theory and in practice, studies are free of charge, so it should make life easier for not so wealthy students.
The situation in England, and this is anecdotal, and again I'm not so sure of the figures, but my impression is that it is absolutely clear to me that in the past universities like Cambridge did accept people who came from privileged backgrounds just because they came from privileged background. I'm quite sure there's none of that now. And I'm quite sure that Cambridge tries very hard to find people from not wealthy backgrounds. They have an outreach program, and it appears to me they tried this with vigour. The problem is the difference of the high schools that the children go to. They also set a fairly tough entrance examination, and it's quite hard for someone who went from, who goes to an undistinguished high school in perhaps a poor part of the city, to get the training and background and the teachers that happened there. So I slightly have the impression that Cambridge is more socially selective in terms of class background than it was when Nigel and I were there. On the other hand, the number of female students, which was 10% when I was there, probably when Steve was there, something like that, is now very close to 50%. So this has been a very big change in a generation. Okay, a little bit more about what happened to Nigel. The students in that class, well, amongst those who were with Nigel, up there at the top, was Peter Goddard, who finished up as, amongst other distinctions, as director of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. Did you know Peter?
Yes, vaguely. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Was he a friend of Nigel's?
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a formidable mathematician at the top.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, and Sandy Davy was there. Another good person in functional analysis was Peter Dixon. Ian Stewart, who became a very popular writer of mathematics and a very distinguished mathematician at Warwick University, was in the same class with Nigel. He was up there. And I did a little count with Peter Dixon, who is a friend of mine, and we thought that there are at least 40 students in that class who wrote at least one paper that was reviewed in Maths Reviews. So you see there's a substantial part of mathematicians there. Okay, so what did we do? What did Nigel do in his third year? He took part 3, the course that I took in the 4th year. This is a necessary prerequisite to being a graduate student. And then you start getting specialist courses in particular subjects. So what courses do I think Nigel took at that time? Again, I'll detour. This is a little rambling, I'm sorry about this, but the story of someone called Frank Smithers. I don't know if people here know this in the 1930s. And then, 1937, he went to Princeton and became the assistant to a rather well-known mathematician called John von Neumann, who was there. So he did significant work in integral equations and functional analysis in the 1930s. And then in 1939, he did what I think is a very brave thing. The day war was declared, he came back to serve his country. So he could have stayed in America, but chose to come back. And the British, as you may know, were really very intelligent in one respect. They didn't send their mathematicians to be shot in the trenches. They recruited them for Bletchley Park. And so the main person who did this was Turing, whose centenary of his birth this year, I think, Turing. But Frank Smithers was one of those who was recruited to go to Bletchley Park, so that at a time when he was a young man and strong, and that he left mathematics for 7 years to go into reading into cryptography. He then came back to Cambridge in 1947, at a time when the dominant analysts were Hardy and Littlewood. And the term that they used in those days, and I wonder again whether there's any reflection of this in France, there was a clear distinction between hard analysis and soft analysis. Did you have this phrase at all in France?
Not at the time, and not even later. We borrowed it from the British or American colleagues, but the terms analyse dure, analyse molle is a recent thing. I mean, I hear it for 20 years, but not more. But it was important, I think.
Well, Smithers decided to start a course in functional analysis at Cambridge, and he did this in opposition to Hardy. How strong the opposition was, I don't know, but it seemed a fairly brave thing to do at that time. And so he started the course in functional analysis because he was the British mathematician who was well acquainted with the work on distribution theory of Lagrange-Schwarz and so on. I'm a great admirer of that. So he brought topological vector spaces into the fourth year, the part 3 at Cambridge, at the end of the 1940s. His first class had 2 students, one male and one female. And at the end of the year, or a year after, they married each other and wrote a book, and that's the book called Robertson and Robertson on topological vector spaces that you might know. Anyhow, by the time Nigel and I were doing part 3, I would say that functional analysis was perhaps the dominant subject at Cambridge then, and also in your time, I think. Wouldn't that be fair? And there were more graduate students in functional analysis than any other subject.
Probably not in my time. The algebra, group theory.
Now there's almost no functional analysis at Cambridge. It seems a great shock to me, with the place that I think should be somehow the centre really has turned away from this. But the courses that Nigel would have taken in what we call part 3, that is the year before you start being a graduate student, I think they'd be the following. You may be interested to, I made a little list of the courses, and I'm not 100% certain, but my strong guess is that these are the courses that Nigel, I mean, I was in the same class as some of them, but we weren't particularly close friends, but I knew him and we talked sometimes. So Smithers gave a course on functional analysis. Burkill did measure theory. Williamson did topological groups and harmonic analysis. Graham Allen did Banach algebras. Smithers did operators on Hilbert spaces and, the spectral theorem. And then a little aside from functional analysis, I took Frank Adams on algebraic topology. And sort of everybody had to go to Philip Hall on group theory. That was a formidable challenge. Anyone who wanted to do research in algebra really had to master Philip Hall's course. And so we took all these courses, and I think they were pretty intense and a very good preparation. So by the time Nigel would have started doing researches, those were the courses that he would have taken, and obviously in Nigel's case, mastered. I mean, would you say that's stronger, or how would that compare to someone who's starting a PhD in France at about the same
It's
time?
hard to tell because the systems are very different. What I know is that in any system whatsoever, a student like Nigel is not someone you meet very often, but it's relevant to the surrounding in a certain sense. I would say that you may start a PhD in France with less preparation, with less courses than what you describe. The point is that you have to find to take at least 2 graduate courses, of course, with success, and to find someone who is ready to take you as a student, which is in a certain sense more personal, maybe, as a way it works than it could be in Cambridge. I would describe it, but what I say is very rough, and it would demand second thoughts, but I would describe it as much less collective and much more individual. You follow a class, a graduate course, you are successful, and you start building what I would call a relationship. It sounds a little odd, but you start building a relationship with the teacher who taught that particular course. And then you begin the PhD with that given person. But I would believe that when the PhD starts, French students are probably less preparated than the students you just described with this Cambridge system. Probably.
Well, the question of whether you're admitted to the system or to an individual depends crucially on who has the money. And so when Nigel and I, were students taking this Part 3, many of the Part 3 students were applying to be graduate students at Cambridge, naturally. And Cambridge had a fixed amount of money because the government, at the undergraduate level, the government funded anyone who became a student. But at the graduate student level, they could admit they had the money to fund a certain fixed number of students. And the number of people who were doing Part 3 who were trying to be one of those students was clearly greater than the amount of money available. So one entered some sort of competition to do this. So you applied to the university, not to a college now, to get a place and the money and the funding. And then having done that, you made a relationship with a particular supervisor. You couldn't now... I had particularly enjoyed the Banach algebra course of Graham Allen, and obviously I went to see him informally and wondered if I could be his student, and he said, well, you must enter the competition, and then if the system funded me, which happily it did, well, I did finish up as a student of Graham Allen, and my guess is that Nigel did something similar with Ben Garling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, which would be a natural thing to do. So Nigel started working with Ben Garling. And so he had 3 years as a graduate student, as I did. Mm-hmm. What are the characteristics of that? Well, I think we were left to our own to a fair extent. The it's unlike the government-induced system now that in English universities, for better or worse, the bureaucratic system lays down that you must see a graduate student for so many minutes a week or something, and there's great pressure on graduate students on the system to make sure people finish their PhD on time. Things were very different in those days because there was a doctrine that a PhD has to be written by the student. So there's very much a system that the thesis advisor would suggest a problem, and 3 years later you turned in your solution to this problem and got a PhD. It's a curious system, it seems to me. I will confess that I was a miserable failure in my PhD. I detour on a mathematical remark away from Nigel for a moment. I said I wanted to work in Banach algebras with Graham Allen, and for 3 months I read some lecture notes on Banach algebras, and then Graham said to me, well, you need a problem now. Now here's a problem. Consider a uniform algebra on the unit interval whose character space or maximal ideal space is equal to the unit interval, and prove that that uniform algebra is all continuous functions on the unit interval. This is the question that I was set as a student. I thought it was an exercise to sort of begin, and that would take me a week or two. I later discovered that this question had been asked by Gelfand about 20 years later, and I can reveal to you 50 years later that question is still as open as it was when I started it. I'm guessing that Ben Garling did something similar to Nigel, but also I'm thinking that Nigel, particularly taking account his talents, my guess is that he would work fairly independently of Ben Garling. He would follow his own interests. I don't know how often. Do you happen to know how often he saw Ben Garling, or how much did they discuss?
Yeah, it wasn't weekly. It was several weeks.
It's certainly nothing like. Nowadays, I see my students once a week at least, but it was nothing like that in those days. We were very much on our own ways. But somewhere in the middle of that, Ben went to America.
Yes.
May I ask a personal question? Were you went also? Were you married at that time?
We got married then, and then we went. Yes.
Was that a big decision, or was that?
Was
did you go because Ben told you to go, or?
Nigel was kind of iffy about that. I was the one that wanted to go to America.
Right.
So that's kind of how it happened, yeah.
Well, we all know that Nigel went to America. He came back for a few years to Britain, 1 year I think in Warwick, and then he had a position at Swansea University, which was not a beautiful place, Swansea in my opinion, but not a strong math department, and not perhaps appreciative of the talents of Nigel, and therefore he went off to America, and that's where I lose contact with the story. Someone else can take it over. But one or two other remarks about Cambridge at that time that occurred to me. This is the 60s, and I think, well, at least people of a certain age will remember les événements of 1968. Were you on the streets in 68 years old?
I'm younger than Nigel, as everybody knows, so I was still a high school student in 1968. I was 15 years of age. So I followed this with interest, but I did not take part into it. I could hear the explosion from my home in Paris, so that was a lively time, but my contribution was zero. Let me put it this way. Don't tell the police. Either way, I did not contribute to the events. But I followed with great interest.
Well, somehow the myth in England is that the students of the 1960s were revolutionaries. And when my grandchildren sort of look at me and said, "What did you do in the 1960s?" In fact, pretty much like you, nothing. Nothing very much. And I suspect Nigel didn't do anything very much because we were pre the 1968 events, and perhaps we were the last of a rather boring and conservative body of students whose life changed in 1968. I don't know whether that's... Stephen, were you there in 68? No, you're too young.
What I can tell at the purely anecdotal level is that there was still the before and an after. For instance, after 1968, I was still in high school. Everybody found it normal that the students were smoking in class, for instance, during the classes. You know, that was obvious at the time. It would be less obvious today. You could smoke pipe or cigarettes in the high school as a student during the class. That was after 68. Of course, the professor could, but that was already the professor could before, but the students as well could after. Well, end of this anecdote.
Well, we were still in the conservative era in which students who went to lectures had to wear a gown. You know what a gown is? This was still obligatory, and students did this. We had to take formal dinner in halls. I suppose you didn't have to eat the food, but since it was free, and if you didn't, you got to eat somewhere. But of course, you had to turn up in hall wearing a tie, which you see is something that's stuck with me, and in those days, a gown. And there were other social activities, needless to say. I know that Nigel was very strong in chess, and he played for the Cambridge. Well, I mean, he was obviously a very talented chess player from a young age, and I think I may have played. I played for the college at chess, but I couldn't get into the Cambridge team. The Cambridge chess team at that time, in which Nigel was one, was extremely strong. I mean, I think 2 of the 8 players, or whatever it was, finished up as grandmasters and so on in chess. And do you think Nigel was sort of tempted to follow a career in chess rather than mathematics? Or?
I don't think so, no.
He was obviously extremely strong at that. Anyway, that's about all I want to say. I don't know whether Steve has anything to add from that time. But the world has changed very much from those days. But for me, of course, it was a wonderfully happy and stimulating and something of a roller coaster of an experience. I mean, Nigel was obviously right at the top, and he must have enjoyed his time there immensely, do you think?
I think he enjoyed some of it, but I think it was pretty stressful. I think he put a lot of pressure on himself, and every exam he took, he was convinced he'd failed, and so... Yeah.
We'll see.
Oh yeah, I mean, just really, really stressed. Very stressed.
It's to make a general comment on the system in those days. I think it was enormously wasteful of talent, because this university in the math department was taking in 300 students a year, and 60, as I say, something like 1 in 5, got a first class. I got a reasonably comfortable first class. Nigel got a high first class, and we were not free of pressure. The trouble with the system then was that, say, if you were in the bottom half of those 300, that means you'd probably come top of your high school in mathematics, you'd got there, you had a love for mathematics, a talent in mathematics, and basically you didn't understand anything when you got there, and you became rather unhappy. So I think the country, the system was very much designed for the first-class students, the top 20%, and sort of more or less forgot about the weaker but still strong students, and it gave them a degree. It didn't throw them out, but did they learn a great deal of mathematics? And these are many people who would have gone on to be high school teachers of mathematics, for example, and the system did not treat them well. Well, I think it's somewhat softer. What do you think? That's true of your time there?
It was the same when I was a student in the late 70s. Very much catered to the top students.
So somehow I thought the country was losing a certain amount of talent in that way. Anyway, I've got you as far as Nigel getting a PhD and going off to America, and then someone else has the story from then on.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So you said that the interaction with your advisor, with Nigel's advisor, was minimal. So
Well,
did the students organize their own seminars?
Ah, yes, that's a good point.
Graduate students.
Yes, I should have said that, so thank you very much. First of all, I'm not saying that the relations were unfriendly.
Well, you said they were limited.
They were limited. This was the tradition. But there was a weekly seminar in functional analysis that had been started by Smithers. And I wonder whether this could have been one of the first in the world. I mean, in around 1950, before then, in the past, there had been general colloquia where someone comes in to talk on some topic in mathematics. But Smithers organised a weekly seminar that was half graduate student and half visiting lecturers. And although I didn't talk to my advisor very much, I benefited enormously from talking to the other students of the weekly seminar. That was excellent, and I wonder, would that have been normal in an American university in, say, 65 to 1970, or?
Well, certainly there would be, no, I would not say so. There would be the general colloquium, general mathematics colloquium, but not specialized seminars at that point, maybe a little bit later.
The other thing that we had in connection with this was that we were allocated papers to read. So there would be 10 graduate students in functional analysis in this seminar, and then Smithers would say, well, even if he wasn't the supervisor, he ran the seminar, and he would give you quite a challenging paper to explain to the other students in functional analysis. That was tough at times, trying to decipher fairly impenetrable papers and present them clearly to other students was very good training, I think. That was a great success of the system, in my opinion. Yes. Did you do that in France?
Well, it's quite comparable to what you described, but again, it could depend a lot upon the advisor you are dealing with. I mean, my advisor was Choquet. I mean, somebody I liked very much, but he never gave me a single question. We would meet from time to time. I would tell him what I was doing. He was trying to read my poor essays, mathematical essays, the best he could. But I was left totally alone for finding my own questions, which is something I liked, like probably some people in this room know, because asking questions is much easier than solving them. That's something I practiced a lot for the last 40 years. But I got that training from Choquet, because if you could not produce your own questions, you are dead, okay? Because he would not help you. But that was his kind. What I think is globally true in my generation is that advisors were trying to be helpful, and maybe by creating the atmosphere of a seminar, by of course giving sometimes an ID and so on, but you were to a very large extent left on your own. That is, there was the kind of pressure you described, that is, you don't want to make a fool of yourself in front of everyone. Okay, if you share your office with Tarragone, you want to produce at least 1/10 of what he does, just to show that you exist, that you are not just a dead fish. But still, to a very large extent, people were left on their own with the global pressure of, say, mathematics in Paris. I would guess, I was not there, but the pressure of mathematics in Cambridge could probably be compared to the pressure of mathematics in Paris. And people at the time would rely just on the global pressure, rather than trying to be really helpful with this particular person. But again, it's a very personal view. Everyone is welcome to disagree with that view. Also, it's a view back from the early 70s, as far as I am concerned. So things could have become very different since then.
Well, I'll reveal one impression that there was in Cambridge in those days. In functional analysis, the myth was that Paris was stronger than Cambridge.
Very good.
I don't know. There was this theory that we didn't know anything about Moscow, say, or anything about America in those days, but there was the impression that we were striving to get to the same level as Paris.
We were right to invite you.
Well, were we right or were we wrong? Maybe they had the opposite impression.
No, Paris. I have the right to make a disciple. So Beata was kind enough to ask a question. There might be more questions from the audience.
Thomas, do you think of, how does this compare to the mathematical training you had, for example?
Germany is completely different. We are not as centralized. Germany is completely decentralized, at least at the time. We don't, in Germany we have 50 people that could be mathematics. It's kind of equally risky. No, in France is of course centralized, and England too, right? Like Britain has Cambridge and Oxford, and in Germany you have... No, I think the only time in my school studies I felt under pressure was the 1 year I spent in Paris.
I should say actually, to fix my words, not only because I want to keep my friends, but also because it's true there are very good mathematics in France outside Paris.
I suppose the one place that I've been to where I felt the quality of mathematics on a very wide scale was for reasons that are obscure now, but at a time when the Soviet Union was still closed, more or less, that there was very little contact between Russia and Western countries. I, with someone else, was asked to go to, why me, I've no idea whatsoever, but I went to Moscow, the Moscow State University, to try to make some sort of assessment of the relationship between the maths course at is there anyone here who was a student at Moscow State University?
I was a student at Moscow University from 1966. And what I would like to say, I don't know, my supervisor met me several times, and he gave me a problem, which as a student it was possible, but then he just started to give me a problem which was impossible to solve. So he was okay to meet me, but it was impossible, for me it was impossible to solve. It was something in 24-dimensional space. and I couldn't see.
Well, I found that when I did this sort of survey, they were doing Galois theory in the first year at Moscow State University. I thought, that's beyond anything that we were doing, for better or worse. And I also went to seminars there, and in fact I gave a seminar, and it was supposed to begin at 5 p.m. or something, and I vaguely thought, well, this will be an hour's seminar, but unlike anywhere else, I got into about 4 minutes through my seminar and I was interrupted, and it went on, so it took me about 2.5 hours to get through the talk and so on. But, so it did strike me that Moscow and Paris would be very strong places at that time. But this is getting away from the story of
At the
Nigel.
time there was a lot of the courses, experimental courses. And I remember that during my second year, I took 11 special courses.
Second year as an undergraduate?
Yes, undergraduate.
And what was the level of these courses?
Yes, but after this I started to hate mathematics for a year.
So, in the years you were working with Nigel, of course he was formidable in many different areas, but were there any gaps? Were there sort of things that you... I mean, I've worked with some extremely strong mathematicians, but sometimes I've found it... I mean, of course I have huge gaps, but sometimes I've been a little surprised by how even very strong mathematicians suddenly don't seem to know something. I mean, were there areas of mathematics that you thought Nigel wasn't?
It happened exactly once that I knew something Nigel didn't know. And that's the kind of thing you remember. He did not know that every finite field is commutative.
Oh,
Okay, so that's something I remember when it happened, where it happened, and how it happened. I didn't know then, you know. So that was striking enough, you know, and I was not faking it. Did not know that result. That's the only gap I ever noticed as far as...
We won't embarrass you by asking how many times Nigel noticed that there were things that he knew and you didn't know.
I think he stopped counting extremely early. It's a finite number but close to omega zeros. I didn't try that.
Okay. I think I've finished. So if anyone has some more questions or any more stories about the later life of Nigel or anything,
I think we are ready to thank Garth Dales for this wonderful testimony.